everybody. I'm Jonathan Sudar, CEO and founder of Turing. And we're here today for Turing's Distinguished Speaker Series. This is a series where we interview leaders from different fields. Today, the theme is how to scale unicorns in a remote-first world. And we have with us a very special guest, Sandesh Patnam, a VC at Premji Invest, who'll share a little more with us on what he's observed with companies going through this exciting growth stage. And without further ado, we'll dive right in. Sandesh, before we get into scaling unicorns in a remote-first world, you have a decade of experience as a managing partner at Premji Invest. And you've guided a number of companies through this hypergrowth phase. And we'll define hypergrowth as the post-unicorn growth phase. And before we get started with specific questions, I'd love to hear more about how you got into VC and what excites you to have stayed in the industry for as long as you have.
Jonathan, good to be here, and thanks for having me. It's definitely a pleasure speaking with you. I'd say, I'm an investor by chance, not by design. And if I go back to my early days, sort of in the mid-90s, doing engineering work, I was an architect, thinking about high-end microprocessor design, looking at cutting-edge sort of next-generation systems. And I was at Stanford doing my master's and running a group called BASIS, which is the Business Association for Stanford Engineering Students, and trying to recruit, VCs to be the leaders in business plan competitions. And, one thing led to another. I tried to recruit a couple of VCs. The interaction was great. I would then be called upon to do diligence on a bunch of comm-focused IC companies. And then I did a startup that eventually got acquired at the peak of the first bubble to a company called PMC Sierra in Canada. And then post that, I was trying to figure out what to do next. And one of the VCs that I'd interacted with said, look, we really enjoy how you think about, technology. Why don't you try this for a few years and see how you like it? And little did I know that, my company was around only for about 2 years. And we had a quick exit, and this was back in the day. So I thought, hey, this is kind of easy. We would go in and we define the idea, get a few customers, and everything that we did after I became an investor for the first 3 or 4 investments had the same playbook. We did the investment, the architecture was defined, and within maybe about 15 to 18 months, these companies got acquired. So we never experienced, I would say, the scaling journey like what you experience today. And then the second bit would be that, the hard part of the next decade of really building companies, you learn venture in a way that I don't think you would learn otherwise if you don't go through sort of a significant down cycle. So for me, the journey to venture was more happenstance at the end of the day, not by design. But once I got into it, I have absolutely loved the entire journey. So I've had the opportunity, lucky for me, doing early, mid, and late stage venture, then running public markets at scale, both on a long biased fund, as well as in a market neutral format for a number of years before joining Premji Invest to build out a crossover strategy, which sort of marries all ends. And we can get into the details of why that makes sense. But, look, I think the journey is phenomenal. I love the excitement of the entrepreneurs, new ideas, the scaling. The scaling is, I think you hit upon a great topic. I mean, people think about getting to become a unicorn, but what after, right? I think that is actually the harder part, right? Yeah. And to me, it's phenomenal to kind of go through that scale piece.
Yeah, that's great. That's great, Sandesh. I didn't realize that BASIS is still like the de facto Stanford entrepreneurship student club. Like we've done a lot of events with BASIS in the past. Like when I was at school, I didn't realize that
1995, not to date myself, 95, 96, 97. So
that's great.
There you go. Yeah,
it's great. And Sandesh, so let's assume a company has reached a unicorn status, and now they are in that post-unicorn scaling phase. What do you find as the primary shift in the way companies that you advise and are on the boards of? Like what do founders, CEOs have to change in that post-unicorn phase versus the earlier stages of company building? What's different?
That's a great question. I mean, there are so many elements. I think it's not I mean, this is in no specific order, but I'll sort of, walk through a few things in my observation that I've seen people do well. And I think the other side of the same coin is if you don't do it well, I think you end up having, less success. And, not that is the end of the road, but you have to pivot and move things around to get back on track. So what I would say is, look, valuation aside, the scaling journey is one that when you reach, there's two elements to it. So if you think about your market sizes as the first aspect to it, there's a certain segment of the market that your go-to-market motion or your product has a very good fit. And let's just hypothetically say 100% of the market, the first 15 or 20% has a certain access criteria, right? So you've built a product that works for the first 10%, and you're prosecuting that path. And there's probably, if it's a large enough market, you've probably got tons of runway to get access to that market. But generally, the remaining 70 or 80 or 90% of the market has some other issues, whether it's tied up in some fashion, it's attached to something else, it's not easily accessible with this product suite, your go-to-market motion needs to shift. And you have to start thinking about how you have to shift the company on all of its elements, product, go-to-market, and all of the other sort of things that you have to do to address the parts that are then locked in some way, right? And so this could be price elasticity, it could be the scale economics, it's thinking about how you have to move up market or down market or side market. You have to think about that. And I find very few management teams and entrepreneurs can prosecute both of these things nearly simultaneously. And you have to do it nearly simultaneously because at the time it hits you, you won't realize it's hitting you. This is what ends up happening in a lot of cases, right? You'll say, okay, you go to the board meeting or you have these discussions with the team, and they're like, well, our sales efficiency has come down. We probably hired the wrong people, or we've got to do this and we have to respond to an RFP and we have to change a few things in the product. And it seems very linear, but it's linear because you haven't really thought through what the other side needs to look like. And then you're trying to connect the dots and you're always a step behind. And the result is either the margins profile breaks down, or your growth slows down for some reason because you've introduced this new product. Or then, as if your founders don't really see the vision on the other side, then they start thinking about an exit, really. Maybe this is kind of the market. Maybe I need to think about other outcomes. We should be part of this other company. So then we can then go access this other thing. So I feel like that journey of understanding what parts of the market you really are addressing, the true, like be very maniacally focused on understanding that, and where the next segment lies. And so I think bridging those two things, very few management teams do well. And if you can do that near simultaneously, I won't say it's simultaneously because you got to focus on your existing business. But near simultaneously, think of cresting of waves, right? The first wave comes, the second wave goes. You have to ride these waves perfectly. If you can do that, then you can have this growth rate that allows you to forget about evaluation. Can you get to the 100, then the 200, then the 500, and the billion? That growth rate can only be sustained if you're thinking about both elements simultaneously. So that's one aspect of it. And I know it's a very broad way of describing it, but if you double click on it, there's so many elements to it, right? It's the people, it's the processes, it's the culture, it's how data focused you are, and all these are subtle things at the outset. But in a lot of cases, the processes and the people that get you to the first 100 typically are not the people who get you to the next 200 or the next 500. And somebody asked me in one of my companies, and this is very great, said, and this is not coming from me, and I actually thought it was a great point. I said, when do you feel like you've hired the guy that gets you to $1 billion or hired the guy that gets you to 500? And the answer to me was, you never hire that guy, always recruiting. You're always recruiting for that next layer, right? The person who gets you to 100, very few cases, I'd say, where the person scales all the way through. But a lot of cases, you have a different mindset. So people who break the mold initially are not the people who are sort of process oriented. You have to have the repeatability at scale. And I think that element to me was very salient because you'd say, okay, I've hired this now A team and we're ready to go, right? You're never really done. Right? That is really the point, right? So the A team is the A team for now, and the A team for future is different. And you can do that many different ways. There's different people who are learning mindset in different ways. But I think the one thing I would tease out mostly is that people processes and that consistent thinking about that next unlock.
Sandesh, that was super insightful. Um, and you touched upon one thing that's very important, which is you're talking about like a shift where you've kind of you started off with that early adopter 20% or so, and now what will it take to get to that next 80% of your customer segment? And the people, it may require changes in people, changes in process, changes in product, and it's sort of a continuous thing. There's not going to be like one single day where like, oh, what we did so far doesn't work, we have to do something different. It's going to be a continuous change, and perhaps you might observe it in your sales efficiency going down, or some other objections you run into now that you didn't run into before, or maybe your close rates are going down, or maybe your sales cycles are taking longer. What metrics would you look at? Like, what would be the canary in the coal mine that you are sort of breaching that band? And let's, wherever that band lies, where you have to make a change, like what metrics would you look at? Like as a,
it's actually it's always in the go-to-market function, right? The first signs of some distress comes where your product and your vision is meeting the customer.
Yes.
And the feedback there is what you really have to pay, very detailed attention to.
Yeah.
And the reaction, if you haven't thought through this other side, like what does that journey look like? What is the reaction? You go, oh, my sales cycles are extended, or maybe we didn't hire the right salespeople. Okay, let's hire the right salespeople. Oh, sales enablement was bad. Let me go fix sales enablement. Oh, you know what we should do? Our sales leader is not, like, he's a very early stage sales leader. And now I need to hire this person who is more of a sales ops-ish person who can then instrument the business. Maybe the rigor around closing is not good enough. Your marketing is not doing a good job of layering on top something that allows us to create the pull motion. These are all reactions. And you see many, many, many discussions at the board level everywhere, where when you hit this first skid, these are the questions you get asked.
But
nobody asks the fundamental question. The fundamental question is there something changing in your customer base? Is there something changing in the market? Is there, are you moving up market? Are you moving into a new vertical? Are you going to a new geo? What is that unlock? And does that require something else? Before we start saying, let's look at this granular data and let's start hitting the nail on the head. Look, let's get the new CRO and let's get an inside sales org, or let's build out field sales. But you can do all of those things, by the way, and you should, but you have to have a very good understanding of what that next unlock is. If this first 20% gets you something, what does the next 15% look like? And I think drawing those two things in parallel will allow you to at least make those decisions much more pronounced. I just feel like a lot of times you just react. And that I think is a more salient point here.
It's good. I'm what I'm taking back from this is being on the lookout for what's the next unlock. Has anything changed with that next set of customers that we want to go after to keep expanding, and being mindful of that. You also touched upon one thing that is super interesting for at this stage, Sandesh, which is up-leveling the team, right? And the fact that the team is not a constant, like at any, it's the team that gets you to a certain stage may not necessarily be the team to get you to the next stage, and you kind of have to constantly think through that. And maybe there is you're always recruiting, you're always sort of figuring out what's the right composition to go win the market for this next stage of growth. What advice do you give to CEOs as they go through that process of thinking through whether it's the right team, whether any changes need to be made? What advice do you give to CEOs on how to think about that, how to manage the change during those phases when somebody needs to be layered or replaced? What is your advice on being on the board of a lot of these hypergrowth companies?
And this may sound too capitalistic or too brutal. A lot of CEOs, and I think this is not a knock on anybody, but I think they tend to want to be very loyal to that initial team, and I think there is no fault in that. Like, I think that is great. That's what engenders so much of success and value. But you have to also be very brutal about your thinking about scale, right? Mm-hmm. So it's always a hard decision because it's the same thing in product and processes. It's all about the people, right? At the end of the day, the first thing you may think about, well, let's coach this person, right? Let's get him a coach, or maybe his communication skills are lacking, or let's get somebody else to help him think through this or that. And in some cases, I would say, yes, it works. But you have so many battles. Startups are hard to do. It's a lonely journey for a lot of founders and CEOs. Having that equivalent thought partner, as well as the person who can do the execution at that scale, if you are doing their job or have to think about it, then you're not thinking about something else. So to me, and the reason I say it's sort of a little bit brutal and capitalistic is that, a lot of CEOs say that, well, you know what, in reality, I should have probably let that person go a year earlier or 6 months earlier, or when I first had the thought. I held on for too long. I'd say the thing that I would say that is most important is to make that, some cases, you have people who've scaled, but I'd say, but in a lot of cases, you have lived that journey way too long. So be a little more brutal about that, and is kind of the first, a salient advice I'd say. And I've never heard a CEO say, well, I'm glad I didn't fire him a year ago, or him or her a year ago. It always seems like the right decision, and it always should have been done in hindsight. Because I think once you make those decisions and you say, okay, this goal is set, let's go charge, and that's really what you want. And you don't want this hangover of like some, part of the organization that's not performing at scale. And this pivot from early to late in the growth journey is, you don't think about processes as much in the early, journey. You're trying to break things, and you have to have a fast-moving situation. But when you have $100 million of revenue or $200 million of revenue, and you're trying to double or triple that, the kind of person who can do that is slightly different. They do focus on people development. They do focus on processes. They do focus on repeatability. And I think those are the metrics, I think, that really allows you to get to that next phase. Because you can't have what worked in the first 20 or 30 or the first 50 customers really work for the next 1,000, right? So I think that's what I would say.
You're right, Sandesh. It's such an asymmetric decision. Like, I hear a lot of other CEOs, like some of my other friends, other founders, talk about, I probably should have let go of this person sooner, or I should have fired this person sooner. You don't hear about the reverse, right? No, I should have. It's telling in that everyone makes a mistake only in one direction, which is they're late to fire, or late to replace, or late to layer. And it's kind of interesting. I'm curious if somewhere there's a CEO saying, "Oh, maybe I should have not made this change." So clearly,
there's always exceptions.
There's a loyalty bias for sure, and I'm sure I also probably have that.
It's hard. This is actually a very difficult thing to do, because you've gone to battle with a bunch of people that now you have built innate loyalty to as a result. And it's not that you should let them go, right? If you can get them to the right structure where they can continue to be successful, that's fantastic. It's not a bad outcome. And maybe eventually they grow into what you wanted them to be, but it takes a couple of years. But you can't afford to do that, right? In some ways,
And for me, usually one clarifying thought is to remind myself of my primary job, which is to grow business value. It's my primary job is to make sure the value of the business is maximized, the value of the company is growing with the steepest possible slope. And if I do that, then I'm able to help everyone who has access to equity in the company, employees, shareholders, investors, everybody others, basically doing what's good for maximizing company value, over time, that. That is.
No, that's great. I agree with that. You didn't ask me this question, but I was going to suggest something, which is, and I think a lot of people who go through this journey think about this. And there's a book that I recommend sometimes, depending on the situation. It's a book called Seven Powers by Hamilton Helmer, and it talks about sort of this potential value, and has this thing about sort of market scale and power, and these 7 things that one needs to think about. And it comes in different matters: scale matters, network economics, counter positioning, it's branding, it's cornered resources. It lays out the dynamic between strategy and power, and how you can continue to think about potential value. And I think that is, I found, there's lots of books written about scaling. This one, just for the mathematically oriented, tries to quantify a bunch of these things and write it in an equation form, which, as as a former engineer, I love to see equations and everything.
Yeah.
So this it was close, near and dear to me. And so it's a book that is interesting. It's a little dated, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, but it's worth a read.
Yeah. Thank you, Sandesh. So Seven Powers, and who was the author?
Hamilton Helmer.
Absolutely. Yeah, looking forward to reading that. And I
Yeah.
love that there are equations in it. For me, if there are numbers in it, I feel like I understand the content a little bit better.
Yeah, yeah. And it describes, I think, what you just alluded to earlier. How do you consistently create value, right? And that, so understanding at a very innate level why scale matters, whether it's reduced costs for you or, inherently very high costs for somebody to enter the space.
Yeah.
Think about network economics, benefits that you have from a single customer or a single user that can then help the rest of the users and the rest of the customer, creates a bigger barrier to entry.
Yeah.
The counter positioning, right? Netflix versus Blockbuster, Vanguard in the ETF space versus everybody else in the equity space. This counter positioning that makes it implausible, and something that's very applicable to you in many ways. This counter positioning is huge because I think that creates a barrier to entry that allows you to scale quite tremendously over time. And in counter positioning, there's lots of different elements. There is obviously the notion of better deliverables, but also distribution, which I think people don't think about.
Yeah.
And you have a distribution capability that's different than a lot of the other typical go-to-market distribution functions, right? Yeah. So I think this counter positioning thing needs to be thought about. And I'm not saying anything that is not in this book, but it's worth reading. And I'm trying to fetch from memory from a few years back. But those were things that I took away that were very interesting to me.
Yeah. Sounds good, Sandesh. We'll definitely read that and think, and particularly the parts about counter positioning. I feel like I haven't really read a lot of material on counter positioning in sort of other books or other blog posts in the space. So I'm definitely interested to go deeper on that.
Yeah.
And are there any other books that you find yourself consistently recommending to your CEOs? Other books, blog posts, videos for this stage?
There are lots of. Listen to your podcast, Jonathan. But I think this is a good one. I think that it depends, right? I think a lot has been written about culture.
Yeah.
And an owner's mindset or things of that nature, which I find there's a few books, and I have to think about exactly which ones I'm thinking about here, from what I would recommend. But I think those types of that type of thinking is also to build culture is very critical.
Yeah. For me, I find myself recommending High Output Management by Andy Grove, 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel, and Blitzscaling by Reid Hoffman to a lot of my exec team.
Yeah. All great books. All great books. Read them all. Yeah.
That's great. And for the next question, what are some common mistakes that you see companies make at this stage of scaling, Sandesh? Any pitfalls to avoid for management teams, CEOs?
I think it's sort of the same thing, but I would say one thing that the other side of the coin of what I had alluded to earlier.
Yeah.
But you can't at any level reverse engineer things. You can't say, and this is a purely evaluation point. Like you can't sort of go say, well, I need to be here, and therefore I need to do these things. I think the business supports certain organic linear motions. And I think you have to really focus on the internals of it. And a lot of times, people try to figure out what that next big milestone is from an evaluation point of view and over optimize from a structure perspective, and a go-to-market perspective and the messaging perspective, while the there is not there, right?
Yeah.
And I think there is no shortcut in terms of time and people and process. Mm-hmm. And so trying to shortcut it in some ways and trying to fast forward things sometimes always ends up creating holes within the organization and the product and the go-to-market that will eventually come back to bite you. Mm-hmm. So I'd say, a lot of times you feel like you've arrived and you're already thinking about the next thing and you try to accelerate the process. And we've gone through like the last 2 or 3 years where, the speed with which rounds were being done has led to sort of what I would say no meaningful internal processes getting built or risks taken off the table between rounds. So I'd say don't over-index on that and focus on the organic next steps while knowing what that end goal is and watching out for these big inflection points where your customer base changes, and therefore let's look at what that means as opposed to trying to fix a sales problem or something like that.
So don't take any shortcuts. Like, what is an example? Like, can you share like any example of a way you could take a shortcut that kind of burns you?
It's I'd say it usually ends up in product in many cases, at least in my experience. And it's the organic versus inorganic question. And so we were talking about unicorns at scale. I'm not talking about, many companies that are probably getting there, right? And when you reach that stage, you feel like you have the equity value to go do that. And in a lot of cases, that comes with so much downside. And whether it's people, processes, product integration, go to market. And I'd say a common error in a lot of cases is like, hey, this is something that we have the equity now to go buy like 1, 2, 3, 4 things to go do this so that I can get to that next milestone quicker. And I'm talking about a funding milestone in this case. And therefore, I feel like the decision to do so has to be organic, has to be like, this is why we're doing it, as opposed to thinking, hey, if I do this, I know my prior round was maybe valued more than it should, whatever the dynamic is. Then I'm going to say, okay, well, if I do this and this, then my revenue or my product is going to look like this, and therefore justify the next whatever, right? Next up round. And I feel like that is more common than you would imagine. And I think a lot, I think a lot of early stage VCs would probably caution you against it. So they've been through that journey in many companies, but I still see that as being at least the $1, $2, $3, $4 billion journey. You don't have the same level of thinking because the boards have changed now, and you have more, later stage, public market oriented investors in these things. For big public companies, it makes a ton of sense. There's not enough maturity built into these companies to be able to absorb another company. So the quicker shortcut, I say, is really that organic was inorganic, and it always stems from product, in my opinion.
Got it. So the mistake would be to do any aggressive acquisitions to sort of quote unquote beef up the product in some way, thinking that will sort of offer some sort of inorganic growth acceleration. And more often than not, these types of acquisitions at this stage in the company don't tend to move the needle in a positive way.
Yeah, too much downside is what it's.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah,
that's super interesting. And in terms of like, what's the most common piece of advice that you see Sandesh offering boards of companies that he's on at this stage?
I'd say culture. Culture is, I think, very, very important at this stage. And I think that you have to be very cognizant of pockets that may develop within the company that tend to be not like, there's this macro teams or teams that are like, hey, we're doing this and we're like this A team and we're going to do that. And they do certain things that are maybe different from, the culture you're trying to build. And maybe they have success. And the hard thing to do is to understand that the success is coming at a cost. And recognizing that and fixing it early, because it eventually always comes home to roost, and you really don't want that headache. So I'd say, the culture aspects of it, look, you're running so hard and so many aspects. You tend to sort of think of that as more of a byproduct of your mission, but culture stands on its own, right? And I think the type of people you bring into the organization, the learning aspects of it, the ability to grow people internally, those things matter a lot. And I think, for the ones that are sustainable and can really build massive businesses, spend a lot of time thinking about that.
Thanks, Sandesh. And the purpose of this podcast is to be useful for founders navigating this stage of growth, the post-unicorn scaling stage. We also have Kat from my chief of staff team here. And Kat, I feel, is definitely going to be a future founder, future CEO. So I'm going to invite Kat to ask any question to you for this stage of company building.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's great to meet you, Sandesh. My question for you is, what traits or skills do you think are most important to develop for future founders who want to build successful startups?
Gosh, I think that question should be addressed to Jonathan at this point. Look, I think I would say it's incredibly lonely, this job, and in many ways, right? Being a founder, having a vision. In a lot of cases, I think the world's telling you something different. The incumbent is saying that they can, do what they need to do to kill you or crush your, idea or your product. I think the most important trait is resilience, and being able to truly understand your vision, stick by it, and in the face of a lot of things in the market that's telling you otherwise, to be able to power through it. It's hard to quantify, and you kind of see it when you see it, type thing. And we see some founders that it's very obvious that they're willing to take on that challenge. And for us as a firm, to be honest, we're really looking at companies that can thrive in the public markets, not that as a liquidity event, but mostly as a sense of quality and size of opportunity that they're pursuing. And we spend a lot of time listening to these great business leaders in the public markets that are creating tremendous value. And there are lots of subtle points, how they talk about their business, the vision they portray, the durability of that business model, how they communicate that vision. Those are really, really important aspects. And the idea is to create that dot plot and potentially identify people who have that similar capability. Everybody has a nuance, right? So, but I'd say that is how we would think about it. I think resilience in those cases is kind of a key attribute in my mind.
Thanks for sharing.
Thank you, Kat. And Sandesh, I think we're at time. We maybe have time for one more question. Could you tell us a little bit about Premji Invest? What types of companies do you look for? What types of founders should come and speak with you? And what makes Premji Invest, like what's unique about Premji Invest, and what makes the firm a good partner for companies at this stage?
Yeah, I'd say the first thing is, as a firm, we're fairly mission-oriented, and we're not a fund that is in the typical context of a growth or a crossover fund. We directly invest on behalf of an endowment or a foundation. The foundation is focused on enhancing primary education in developing countries, seeded initially by a gift by Azim Premji, the founder and chairman of Wipro. And since then, our goal is to create a corpus, an endowment that's of size that can continue that vision or the foundation's aspirations in perpetuity. So that's at a high level, it's got a very mission orientation to it. What that means is we want to partner with companies which have enduring value. Mission accomplished for Premji Invest, which is the fund that supports the endowment, is if we can hand back to the endowment, say 20 or 30 companies, each worth many $billion each, I think that is mission accomplished. What that means then is that we want to invest in companies that can create significant market cap and thrive in the public markets for extended period of time. And so we run a crossover fund, so public markets and private markets in some ways. So we understand what a company that thrives in the public market looks like. And the idea is to create the dot plot and identify companies that have similar aspirations, moats, business model, the whole bit in the earlier stages, and partner with them through the entire journey. And so that's sort of where we are focused on. If through our diligence process, we conclude that this is more like an M&A event, it's unlikely that we end up investing in these companies. And so, largely I'd say that is the broader vision of the firm. Thematically, we do everything tech, consumer, healthcare, and fintech. And typically, I think the right stage for us is companies that have achieved product market fit and are going through that scaling journey that we just described.
Yes.
So that scaling journey is sort of where we can be really helpful. And the one distinguishing factor for us is we're a very product-oriented firm. So early stage venture has a bunch of people that have that orientation. Later stages, you have people that think about public markets and models and valuations. We do that as well, just as well as anybody else, but we have a very strong product orientation. And the idea is to think of product at scale. What product gets you the first 100 million, gets you the next 500 million. We're really thinking about that at scale. And we've seen that journey now with a bunch of our companies, MuleSoft and Anaplan and Coupa and Zora and name it. And I think we're singularly focused on that aspect. And I think that is a differentiator for us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sandesh. And if people want to learn more, like how do they reach you or Premji Invest?
By design, we're largely invisible. But I think, yes, anybody can drop me an email. It's sandesh@premjiinvest.com.
That sounds great. That sounds great. I was just joking with one of our partners at Westbridge that, a good VC homepage should just be like a complete white page with like nothing on it, maybe except the logo, and that just says "Talk to our founders" or something like that, and maybe, or like one email. Like
That's a great idea. Maybe we need to incorporate that. It's probably the only way Mr. Premji to allow us to have a web presence.
Yeah,
he's he's an amazing entrepreneur, as many know, and always sort of keeps us in the straight and narrow. The founders do the hard work, at the end of the day. So we want to be mindful and respectful of that.
Yeah, that sounds great, Sandesh. It's been great having you. Thank you for sharing your lessons on scaling unicorns. It's such an exciting stage. It's just so much fun to be in this hyper growth stage, and I'm sure a lot of this will go out to a whole bunch of Turing customers who are building unicorns on top of Turing. So I hope it'll be useful for all of you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for having me.